I always have all these things that I write down that I think people should know that don't work their way out into sermons. Um, this one actually this week did. I mean, I talked about this, I think, about a year ago now. But I kind of wanted to revisit it because when you ask people like what their favorite book of the Bible is, oftentimes they say the book of John. And even a lot of pastors they talk to you like, what's your favorite book? What are you gonna teach through? They say a lot of times the book of John. And you ask them why, they say because the book of John it's the easiest to read sort of story of Jesus and this and that. And so what I kind of want to do is like pick these books sometimes and give you an overview of them. I want to pick like a topic or a book and give you like an overview of like, here's some stuff that'll help you read this book, help you understand it a little better. And I wanted to focus on the book of John today and just maybe give you something you haven't seen before that has to do with the Samaritans. Were any of you there when I talked about the Samaritans about a year ago? A couple people here and there. Okay. I want to revisit some of that stuff because to me, it is probably the most important aspect of reading the book of John. And like, I'll work through this stuff and then we can just hang out and like ask questions or whatever. I'm good until about like probably 10 till 1 or 1 even. So we'll see. So the Samaritans, if you're not familiar with who they are, they're these Bible characters all through the Gospels. They were originally Jews. They were a part of the Jewish people. And during the Babylonian exile, when Israel was ransacked and the whole thing was overthrown and all the people were taken into exile, there were these Jewish people who lived up in the hills around a city called Shechem. They lived up in the hills there and in some of the valleys behind those hills. And they were not taken into exile because they were sort of out on the outskirts. By and large, the people that were taken mostly into exile were sort of honestly the Jewish elite. There was a lot of peasants living in the fields that were never taken into exile, were never taken as prisoners. Everyone who worked in the temple was, everyone who worked in the government was, the kings, the princes, the people who usually lived right in the city, a lot of them were, because they were considered like the upper class, the more elite. There's a book by, I'll give you guys book recommendations as we do this, if you're interested in learning more about this. Horsley, hold on a second. I gotta learn my alphabet here. Horsley, Horn, Hawthorne. That's not it. Give me just a second. You know what? I think I pulled it off my shelf and it's somewhere else in my house. Anyways, there's a book by Horsley about Israel and the politics of like Persia when they were taken over. It talks a lot about this kind of stuff. Who was taken into exile, who was not. So there was a group of Jewish people in the hills and in the valleys around the outskirts of the place that weren't taken into exile, and they were left there for about 430, 450 years. Some argue as much as 500 years by themselves. And what happens is, in 400 years, if your people are gone, I mean, the Babylonians came in, they ransacked the whole city, they burnt down the temple, they destroyed it. So they could no longer practice Judaism. They didn't have any of their texts, and there was no scribes and scholars left to read them the text because 99% of the people back then were absolutely illiterate, even through Jesus' time, even through the early church. And so they had no way to practice their religion anymore. So they're working from bits and pieces and scraps. But they're living up in the hills around there for 430 years I'm going to say. And in that time, their religion begins to evolve and it begins to change. And when stuff is left alone like that, it becomes sort of its own thing. We don't realize when we're in it how quickly our social constructs are changing, how quickly our religion is changing. I think if you were to go back 400 years from now, back into early Christianity, and you were to talk to those people 400 years ago in Christianity, they would tell you you're no longer a Christian today because of a lot of the things that you believe, a lot of the ways that you live. 400 years from now, if you meet Christians in the future, 400 years in the future, you're probably going to meet them and say, well, you're not a Christian because of this and this and this. That's very much like what happened to the Jewish people who were left after exile. After 400 years, their religion had completely evolved. It had changed. It had morphed. It had become something different. They started calling themselves Samaritans. And the way it happened was they had assimilated basically with the Persians, whom the Assyrians, in ancient exiles, when you move one group out, you would take that group where you move these people to, and you would move them into your city. So basically, you're going to take two different peoples, and you're going to swap their homelands and destroy all their temples. Okay? So you're basically trying to erase their identity, and if you're being exiled into a place where you didn't grow up, like suddenly if you pick up my family and you move us to Uzbekistan, and we've never been there, and like even our whole city, you move us to Uzbekistan, and then a war breaks out, we're not going to take up weapons and fight to defend Uzbekistan because we're Floridians, right? Like we're not invested in the location. And that was the whole point of exile. That's why you're moving people from one place to another, so that they don't revolt and they don't give you a hard time. So the Jewish army attacks Samaria eventually, and on one occasion, oh, hold on, we'll get there. I jumped ahead. So over the 430 years, these Jewish people, their religion changes. They can't worship God as they used to. And so they come up with new ways to worship God. They come up with new methods of telling their story. They probably have a few bits and scraps of the text, and they maybe find some scribes to read it to them. And eventually they have a canon of the text, and eventually they write their own books and add them to the canon. So it's sort of like Judaism gets expanded to become this other thing, and they called it Samaritanism. And they even end up building their own temple on the mountain of Gerizim. And they're trying to build it from what they remember, because it's hundreds of years later. They're trying to build it from the memory of that's been passed down from the other people who saw the original Jerusalem temple. And in this whole time, they're attempting to live as Jewish people. They're attempting to follow the laws. They're attempting to live the way the Jewish people did, and follow, not necessarily strictly follow the law, but follow the meaning of the law, like the meaning of love and justice and all these things. And so this is what they're doing. And 430 years pass, and then the exile ends. And then these Jewish people come back from exile, and they begin to rebuild their temple, and they begin to meet these other people who are sort of like, they walk in and they seem to know a lot about Judaism, and they're sort of like, well, we're Samaritans. We're basically Jewish too. And they're like, oh, really? And then so they start hearing their story, and pretty soon they realize, these people believe something different than we do. And there begins to be this division as they realize, oh, you guys built your own temple? Well, that's blasphemy. You have your own place of worship? That's blasphemy. God can't meet you on the mountain of Moriah over there. He can't meet you there. And so there begins to be this strife between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. And it gets worse and worse and worse. They don't see themselves as cousins or related at all. The Jewish people eventually see them as some like bastardized form of Judaism. Like they've taken Judaism and they've ruined it, and they've done something completely different. And so they, again, they're reading their own text that they edited and wrote their own story as God's people, as the Samaritans, into the text. And they're like, well, that's not the scriptures, because it talks about you in there, and you're not one of God's people. We are. So you basically ruined Judaism. And so they continue to follow the laws and the prophets and all that stuff. Eventually, hostility grows between the two groups, between Jews and Samaritans. This is how they became enemies. Yes, Larry. True point. Eventually, there begins to be a lot of hostility between Jews and Samaritans. Think of, like, honestly, the times between Protestant and Catholic. And hostility grew really fast, and Israelites were really quick to disown them and separate themselves. And if you read the apocryphal books, I have some of the Apocrypha and Septuagint here. You can get your hands on one of these, and you can read these. And it talks a lot about their stories. And so hostility grows really fast. The Jewish army eventually attacks Samaria, tries to wipe them out, tries to eradicate them, tries to commit genocide against them. And eventually the Samaritans sort of retaliate by sneaking into the temple at Passover one year and scattering bones around the temple, pretty much defiling it on Passover. This leads to this all-out war. There's a lot of bloodshed. And so here's where I want to go with this. Here's how this relates to the book of John. So that is, I'll sort of put a pin in that. That is the story of the Samaritans. Anytime you read about the Samaritans in the Gospels, that is the backdrop of the whole thing. Every time you read about Jesus' interactions with the Samaritans, that is the backdrop of the whole thing. In case you have ever wondered, like, why do they hate each other so much? That's why. So one of the questions you have to ask when you're reading the Bible is, again, like I said Sunday, why was this book written? Like this particular letter, this particular thing. When the book of John was written, somewhere around like early 2nd century, I want to say like between 100 and 120. I lean towards 120 for various reasons. But when that book was written, when John wrote his book, there were already 3 other Gospels. And they had already sort of spoken to John's audience. And so the question is like, why is John even writing a gospel at all? What's the point of this? Why would he go and redo what has already been done several times? And his is different. I mean, a lot more time has gone by, so it's going to sound a lot more grand. He's going to tell the story a little differently. But why is John writing his gospel? Well, what we know about John's gospel, there was this. Let me find this real fast. There was a book written by a man named Edwin Fried in about, I want to say early 80s, the early 1980s. So not too long ago in history here. And that book lays out incredible evidence, incredibly detailed evidence about what John's church was doing. So John is a pastor of this church. There's a Johannine community. Even after John dies, the Johannine, means it's the Greek for John, Johannine community keeps going. And it turns out that they had an incredible relationship with the Samaritan people living up in the hills. And they had reached out and they had been inviting the Samaritan people into the Christian churches. And they had built this huge relationship. But at this particular time, the Johannine community was very, very Jewish. And so they're worshiping, they're going down to the synagogue. The temple has been destroyed already, but they're still gathering in the synagogues. And they're teaching each other the things of God using the Jewish synagogue, sort of the Jewish educational system. So what happens is John's church begins bringing Samaritans into the synagogues, and it causes this huge uproar. They're like, who is this group of Jewish people that call themselves Christians, who is now bringing in Samaritans? We were okay with you when you were just claiming Jesus was the Messianic king, but now you're claiming that the Samaritans are with you and with us, and we can't handle this. And so the entire Jewish community exiles John's church and pretty much kicks out all the Christians. And this is the part where the Christian community begins to sort of fall apart. There's a book by, well, it's book hour. There's a book by E.P. Sanders. E.P. Sanders called, written also, I think, in the 70s, Jesus and Judaism. And E.P. Sanders is the founder of what's called the New Perspective. That's what, maybe one day we'll talk about that. That's sort of how I read the Bible. And E.P. Sanders wrote this book, Jews and Judaism, to sort of talk about the split between the two and how they were viewed. But eventually John's church is kicked out. They're completely exiled, and it's this apparently really, really hard thing on them. They are taking it like this is their family, and they feel like they're breaking up the family, and they're being, it literally feels like a divorce to them. And they went through this huge time of mourning and writing, and they're really hurt by it. And so all the evidence points to this happened about 5 years before John writes his gospel, which brings us back to the question, why did John write his gospel? Now, if you read the book of John, John has constant references to the Samaritans. The other gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, have like maybe 2 stories. You have the parable of the Good Samaritan, that parable alone is blasphemy to the Jewish people. That the fact that Jesus would come along and take a despised, hated group and tell a story about the Samaritan being the good guy and following the law when the Jewish people didn't. That's really scandalous for the ancient world. And the fact that like we still use the phrase today, Good Samaritan, that's a huge deal. That's like a testament to actually what Jesus does, like takes terrible, awful ideas and people and makes them redeems them and makes them good. The fact that we now refer to people who do good works as a good Samaritan, that's really huge. The ancient Christians would be shouting for joy at hearing that we're still using that phrase today, from their own rabbi. So a lot of scholars claim that basically this is why John wrote the book of John. This is why it's either from John or from John's community, or from fragments John had written, gathered, and put out by John's community. That like this is why this book exists, to help people understand what unity in Jesus is about and how it works and how it functions, and how the work of the church is to gather the outcasts and gather them in, and telling you basically that when you do this, it will be difficult, but this is what Jesus did. And so speckled throughout the book of John are all these stories of the Samaritans. And so I wanted to highlight the one I highlighted before, which was the woman at the well. So grab your Bible, go to John chapter 4, if you would. Turn on your Bible and scroll on down, or type it in the search bar. Okay, so where are we at? Keep that chat box open. So we have on, I want you to go John chapter 4. Let's start at verse 4. Just start right there. Because Jesus is traveling. He's going to Galilee, where he used to live, from Judea, from Jewish territory. And it says in verse 4, he had to go through Samaria on his way. Eventually, he came to the Samaritan village of Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and Jesus was tired from the long walk and sat eagerly by the well about noontime. Soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Please give me a drink." He was alone at the time because the disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. Now, so Jesus goes there. It's Samaritan territory. Jacob's well is there, famous well from the ancient world, from the ancient stories of the Old Testament. And there's a woman there drawing water, and he recognized her. He recognized her as a Samaritan woman. The Jewish people had their own way of dressing. The Samaritans, trying to keep up sort of the idea of holy living, as the Jewish people did, they had a particular way of dressing too. So when you looked at them, you could tell that they were Samaritan. And so Jesus walks up to this woman, and he starts talking to her, and she's very, very surprised. He says, in verse 7, it says, soon a Samaritan woman came to draw water. He says, "Please give me a drink." And he was alone at the time because his disciples had gone into the village to buy some food. The woman was surprised, for Jesus refused to have anything to do with Samaritans. And the audience knows why. The modern audience does not know why, but now you know why. So now you can read this maybe through a better lens here. She said to Jesus, I'm in halfway through verse 9. She said to Jesus, "You are a Jew, and I'm a Samaritan woman. Why are you asking me for a drink?" Okay, so she's very surprised that he's talking to her because they didn't do this. There's several things happening there at this well. First off, she's trying to maintain boundaries. Boundaries in the ancient world were vital. They were important. People didn't mix. Groups didn't mix. And so she starts off basically trying to uphold the boundary, a boundary that's rooted in that history that I just told you. And so Jesus looks at her, and in verse 10, he sort of responds to her, and he says, if you only knew the gift that God has for you, and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. So Jesus is, first off, still water and living water are two different things. And these are actual word phrases that people would use. Still water was like a pond sitting still. Living water was water that was either running down through a river or coming up through a spring. He's not actually yet talking about anything particularly divine. He says, if you only knew the gift of God has for you, and who you are speaking to, you would ask me, and I would give you living water. Living water was superior. It was better. He says, I've got something better, some better water than you can get from this well. And so what's happening here is Jesus is offering her something. In the ancient world, if you offer somebody something, you're offering sort of, it's the word would be grace, but it's an invitation into a reconciliation. in the ancient world, we like to talk about grace as in free grace today. Our theology, rooted in like Luther, has very much come wrapped up in like this idea of grace is something that you just give for free. I'm saved by grace, so God just gives me something for free. And as much as I like the idea, it actually doesn't hold up to ancient scholarship of linguistics. In the ancient world, grace was a relationship. Grace was one person offering something that had somebody that had something better, offering it to somebody that had something less, in the hopes that they would enter into a relationship. And in this relationship, let's say a wealthy person offers something to a poor person. This is an act of grace. It's also an invitation into grace. The poor person can receive it, and their response is now to sing the praises of the person who gave them grace. And that is how basically they would repay it back. It's sort of this thing that goes around and around and around. And so what the rich person gets from this is their honor goes up as the person at the bottom sings their praises, and the poor person actually gets something they couldn't get before. So both of them are being lifted up at the same time by the offer of grace. Okay, that's actually what grace is. And when you read about grace in the Bible, that's actually what's really being talked about. And there's different levels of this, but it's never, I assure you, it is never just have this for free, I'm walking away. It's always an invitation into relationship. So if you only knew the gift God has for you, who you were speaking to, you would ask and I would give you living water. So this is an offer. He's offering to do sort of the grace dance here. He says, we both have things that the other needs. So why can't we sort of both pour them out for each other? You have water that you can give to me, and I have something really good. He's using the sort of the idea of water, and he's saying I have something better than what you have. Living water, he calls it, to pour out for you. And so this is an invitation into relationship, into reconciliation. And so the woman attempts to dismiss it, first off. She dismisses it right up front. She says, but sir, you don't have a rope or a bucket. This well is very deep. Where would you get this living water? So the first thing she does is she dismisses it, and she tries to send it away like we can't enter into this sort of grace relationship here. Now, either she didn't understand that what he was talking about, that he was offering reconciliation, but I think she did, or she didn't want to befriend a Jewish rabbi, which also I think that as well. I think she had a hate for him as much as the Jewish people had a hate for her. And she didn't also want to challenge social norms because she is now an oppressed minority, and it's not beneficial for her to challenge the majority group. It's a very dangerous thing for her to do. And so she dismisses it and moves along. And so Jesus responds. Let's go to let's go to 16. Jesus then says, he says, go and get your husband. Now, this is where the conversation takes a crazy turn. He says, go and get your husband. And she responds in verse 17 and says, I don't have a husband. And Jesus says, you're right, you don't have a husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with now. You certainly spoke the truth. Now, I'm sorry. I'm reading, actually, I don't know why, but I picked up a New Living Translation. I don't know. I like it. But it's not usually what I preach from, but I'm not preaching, I'm just teaching. So, let me clear my throat. So he says, go and get your husband. She says, I don't have a husband. He goes, you're right. You've had 5 husbands. Now, this has been taught for a very, very long time that Jesus approached this woman because she's an adulteress and he's going to call her out on her sin. But if you know anything about the first century, you know that women didn't have rights. They were owned. And women did not have the ability to initiate divorce. So this woman has not left 5 husbands. This woman has not. It's literally impossible in the ancient world that this woman has been divorced 5 times and then remarried. Because first off, she didn't have the actual rights to divorce any man. And second, if she had been divorced, no man would ever have married her again. She would have been considered unclean, and marrying her would have been considered adultery because she's owned by another man. This woman is not an adulteress. That's our modern perception. We're very comfortable with calling women in the Bible adulteresses. By the way, Mary Magdalene was not a prostitute, just throwing that out there. Pay attention to the Marys in the book and the women in the book. It's just normal that we read this and we say, because women today can divorce their husbands, and so we assume, reading through modern lenses, that women in the ancient world could divorce their husbands as well, but they couldn't. So this woman was not divorced. Which is funny. I've quoted this before. John Calvin, in his commentary, here's what I read and what I wrote down from his. He says, the reason of this probably was that being a froward and disobedient wife, she constrained her husband to divorce her. I interpret the words thus. Though God joined thee to lawful husbands, Old English, thou didst not cease to sin until rendered infamous by numerous divorces, thou prostitutest thyself to fornication. That's how John Calvin puts it. Basically saying she's a prostitute and she's left 5 husbands. And then he also says this: Christ, in order to repress the woman's talkativeness, so he thinks she's talking too much, and so Jesus jumps in and accuses her of being a prostitute. That's how John Calvin read this. Christ, in order to repress the woman's talkativeness, brought forward her former and present life to shut her up. That's what John Calvin says. We read the Bible through the lens of which we are given. In John Calvin's day, if you don't know the backstory, that's what you're going to see. Okay, I don't put any blame on him necessarily. I put it on society and the fact that they actually didn't have the scholarship that we have now. We can do a better job of interpreting the Bible today than Luther or Calvin could. Any of you can, because you have more tools at your disposal. So for centuries, we've been saying this woman is a prostitute, but here's the thing. They weren't, she's obviously not. So likely what happens is there's either been war, like decades of war. It's possible that her husband, she had been married 5 times and each one of her husbands had died, that she's been widowed 5 times through her husband's being killed, or there's been famine or disease. We now are finally at a place where we can understand ancient pandemics that spread in the world. Here we are understanding, pandemics are very real and lots of people could die out of nowhere. It's possible that kind of stuff was happening and that she lost 5 husbands in a span of her life so far. It's also possible, and people don't like to talk about this, it's also possible that the editor of the book is exaggerating. However it is, we know that she was not a prostitute. We know that she has not cheated on 5 husbands. She has lived a very hard life is what we know, that she's been through a lot. And let's see, what else do I got here? And then Jesus says this. He says, you're right, you don't have a husband, for you've had 5 husbands, and you aren't even married to the man you're living with now. So what about that? Well, part of Jewish law code was that God instructed his people regularly that if 2 brothers, I mean, you can see this all through the Old Testament. If there's 2 brothers and one of them dies and can't take care of his wife because he's dead, the brother who is not married will take her in and take care of her. And so she's now apparently, probably, it's highly likely that she's either living with the brother of like her brother-in-law, or she is another man in the community has taken her in to take care of her because, again, she didn't have her own rights. She couldn't own land. She couldn't work to make money. This is her life. And so Jesus calls her out. He points all this out, basically showing off that, like, I know things about you, that it's a miraculous things that I know. And so in verse 19, it says, Sir, it says, the woman said, you must be a prophet. So tell me, why is it that you Jews insist that Jerusalem is the only place of worship, while we Samaritans claim that it is here on Mount Gerizim where our ancestors worshipped? So she's like, she understands now that he's offering reconciliation. And so the first thing she wants to do is clear up some bad blood between them. And she's pointing out the fact that the Jewish people have treated them terribly for a very long time now. She's calling it out, and Jesus responds and says, believe me, dear woman, the time is coming when it will no longer matter whether you worship the Father on this mountain or in Jerusalem. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship. And he's not being degrading. He's saying there's a lot of this that you don't know, that you have lost, and it's really the Jewish people's fault. It's almost like he's saying this is our fault, that you don't know. You Samaritans know very little about the one you worship, while we Jews know all about him, for salvation comes to the Jews. But the time is coming, indeed it is here now, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. The Father is looking for those who will worship him in that way. For God is spirit, So those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. And then the woman said, I know the Messiah is coming, the one who is called the Christ. When he comes, he will explain everything to us. And then Jesus told her, I am the Messiah. So this is like a pinnacle moment. The Messiah is now suddenly the one, the king of Israel is the first one to offer reconciliation to this oppressed people that the Jewish people hate. And there's no one there to see it. Jesus is alone with this woman, and he comes to her, and he offers reconciliation between the Jewish people. He says, I'm basically the king of the Jewish people, and I'm offering my hand in reconciliation. He doesn't go to the king of Samaria. He goes to a woman who's lived an incredibly hard life, who has no rights. He goes to the bottom, and he offers this to her. It's really incredible. And then it says right here, everything sort of shifts in verse 27. It says, then his disciples came back, and they were shocked to find him talking to a woman, but none of them had the nerve to ask, what do you want with her? Or why are you talking to her? So the disciples are kind of looking at each other like, this is weird, this is awkward. What is he doing with this woman? Why is he talking to her? Because they have just as much hate for her. And verse 28, it says, the woman left her jar beside the well and ran back to the village. So the village is within sight. If you look this up on a map where they believe Jacob's well was and where this town was that she was in, there's a huge field, well, there was, and some of it's still there, between where they're at and the town that they're in. So they're watching her run away the whole way back to her town, and they can probably see her when everyone in the field, in the town, starts coming out to talk to her. In verse 29, it says, come and see. She goes to them. She gathers all the people in the town, and she says, come and see a man who told me everything I ever did. Could he possibly be the Messiah? So the people came streaming from the village to see him. So we had this moment where all the entire town there of Samaritans, they're coming out of their house. They hear this woman. She tells them the story, and they look over at Jacob's well. They can see it on a map. It's not very far. It's like a quarter mile. And they start walking through the field towards Jesus and his disciples. And while this is happening, Jesus is having his own discussion with his disciples. And Jesus is talking to his own disciples. He's sort of saying the same thing that he said to the woman. He says, hold on a second. His disciples were urging Jesus, Rabbi, eat something. And Jesus said, I have a kind of food that you know nothing about. He's being very cryptic, just like he did to the woman. And then he says in verse 33, did someone bring him food while we were gone? The disciples asked each other. Jesus says, my nourishment comes from doing the will of God who sent me and from finishing the work. So let's pause here. Put yourself in the shoes of John's audience. The year is about 120. You've just been exiled from your community for bringing Samaritans in. And now you have to make a decision. Is it worth losing my community, my Jewish community, with 1,800 to 2,000 years worth of history and prestige to welcome in these outcasts and these Samaritans? Am I willing to take this hit on my identity, on my community, on my life, on who I do business with, on all of this? Are you willing to take that hit? And then you read this in verse 34 here, this whole story of reconciliation. And then you see, my nourishment comes from doing the will of God who sent me and from finishing this work. So there's still work to be done. So John's audience is now hearing that there's work to be done, that there's still more to do. In verse 35, it says, you know the saying, 4 months between planting and harvest. But I say, and this is the peak of the story, I say, wake up and look around. The fields are already ripe for harvest. And at this point, Jesus is always pointing to the things that are around him when he's preaching. Remember that moment where Jesus gets in the boat in the book of Matthew, chapter 13? He gets in the boat and he scoots out, and there's all the people gathered on the shore. And he tells instantly a story about casting seed and where it all is going to land. When he does this, we know where that happened. And right behind the beach, there's a hill going up and there's farmlands. And so while Jesus is preaching in the boat, he points to one of these people scattering seeds. And he says, look at what's happening to the seed. Look where some of it's landing and what's happening to it. Look at some of it lands over here and it's choked out. Look at some of it landing over here. Do you have ears to hear what I'm telling you? He's basically telling them, he's pointing at things all around him while he's speaking. That's what's happening here. So it says these Samaritans are coming out from their town and they're walking through the field and they can see them. And Jesus is talking to the disciples about how you're missing something. You're missing something very important in your life. And it's something, there's work to be done that has not yet been done. And he turns and he points to the Samaritans who are walking through the field. And that's where he says, wake up and look around. The fields are ripe. They're already ripe for harvest. And the harvesters are paid good wages. And the fruit they harvest is people brought to eternal life. What joy awaits both the planter and the harvester alike. You know the saying, one plants and another harvests. And it's true. I sent you to harvest where you didn't plant. Others had already done the work, and now you will get to gather the harvest. So 90% of the time when this passage is taught, it's talking about giving the plan of salvation to people. And while that's true, that's not actually what's happening in the passage. Jesus is pointing at the Samaritan people and saying there's still work to do. There's still work to do right here, right now, where you are. These people have been neglected. They have been treated wrong and unfairly. You hate them. You won't listen to them. You are unwilling to enter into a relationship with them because you're afraid of how it will look and how you will be exiled from your community. And it's the same message that John's church wants the rest of Christianity to know. That's the reason they're writing the book of John, is to tell the story of reconciliation between the Jews and Samaritans, and it's framed in the story of God's reconciliation of the world. And so if God is willing to do this work, to reconcile a people who hate him, who have bastardized his religion, who have treated him poorly for thousands of years, and look how far God is willing to go, coming in the flesh, healing these people, dying on the cross. If God is willing to do all that, I want you now to look at the fields. They're ripe and they're ready for harvest. There are people whom you have neglected and whom you have not brought in. There are people who you are ignoring, who you think you're better than them. You think they're heretics. You think all these things. And he's saying, I actually see them as my future children. And you need to go to them and you need to bring them in. You need to enter into a relationship with them. You need to reconcile with them. You need to be reaching out to them. So the book of John really is heavy on the reconciliation of enemies. It's heavy on that. And so the ancient audience would have picked up on this. And so now, hopefully, when you read the book of John, I want you to look for that if you're reading through it. I want you to look for all the stories of all the Samaritans, how Jesus paints a picture of them. I want you to look for all of the things that are sort of abnormal, that wouldn't have happened in that day, that Jesus doesn't care about, and he does anyways. I think it's a really incredible story. I mean, if you go down to like the story of, in John chapter 9, you have this healing of the blind man, and you have all these Jewish leaders, and there's this blind man there. It says he's born blind, and they ask him, they say, Rabbi, why was this man born blind? Was it because of his own sin or the sin of his parents? And Jesus replies and says, it was not because of his sin or his parents' sin. This happened so that the power of God could be seen. We must quickly carry out the task assigned to us by the one who sent us. So Jesus' answer is not who's at fault. Jesus isn't asking the question, whose fault is it that these people aren't with us? Is it their fault? Is it our fault? Whose fault is it that this man is not doing well? Whose fault is it that there's pain and suffering in our midst? And this is human nature, is to look around and say, it's their fault, it's their fault, it's their fault. It's everyone else's fault but ours. Right down to the words that we use to like push it away from ourselves and say, it's not us, it's them. And Jesus here is not interested in who's at fault. Jesus is interested in how can you help? That's what Jesus is doing. He changes the subject entirely. He's not looking at like, well, whose fault is it? Is it Republicans? Is it Democrats? Is it the Chinese? Is it Americans? Is it some other, who's not doing the right thing? Whose fault is anything? And Jesus says, it's not about whose fault it is. It's what can you do to help? It's what part is, how is God going to show his glory through this situation? And so for so long it had been, the Samaritans are at fault. These people are at fault. The sinners, the peasants, the sinners are at fault. And Jesus, first off, says they belong with us. And second, he says, it's not about who's at fault. It's about who's going to make it right. And so that's what I wanted to put on the table today, for those of you who have a lot of time on your hands and want to read through the book of John and maybe see some things you haven't seen before. And so if you guys have any thoughts about that, questions, thoughts, if you want to tack on anything, hit me. What do you got? And most of your mics are muted, so if you're talking, I can't hear you. So down on the left, there's a little button, mute button. Click that.
Well, I was going to say that I think this is a real problem in the modern American church, because the modern American church points fingers so much. They got AIDS because they were gay. I've heard it for years. And I think it's so often turned people off from the church, because we may be doing works, and I know we are doing works, but this talking about whose fault everything is, it's in society, but it should not be in the church.
Yes. I mean, I would, I would say, and I say this all the time, America is very Roman. We act a lot like the Roman Empire did. We like to battle with each other. We like to point fingers and put blame on each other. And constantly between Democrats and Republicans, they like to blame each other on different sides. And Christians should be above all of this. We really should be on the outside, pointing out the flaws of the empire in general, and also saying, here's the thing, here's what our king is offering. Join us, here's the direction that we're going in. The division between the Jews and Samaritans, and the division between Republicans and Democrats, the message here is very much like you actually belong to each other. And you actually, despite all the ways that you hate each other, despite all the messages that you have for each other and blaming each other for all these things, you're in this together, and you belong to each other. And the solution of the church was to pull back and be a people in the world that was separate from the rest, and to speak truth into it and invite another way. And if you're in the midst of it, if you're in the midst of the fray, identifying with a group that is attacking the other group, you can't possibly establish the kingdom of Christ in the midst of that. The kingdom of Christ sits there beckoning everyone to put down sort of their idols and their desire for victory and pulling in. And when you do that, you give up all of these things that you used to fight for, these things that benefit you and your people that look like you. It's a whole different way. I think the Gospel of John, read the right way, can be incredibly unifying, as well as the book of Romans. But often these books are used to divide people. What else? Any thoughts?
Do you think the different denominations in the church is a division? Protestant, Presbyterian, Methodist, Baptist, so on? Or is that a positive thing?
Depends on what we're talking about. Protestant and Catholic, that's a division. Denominations, those are expressions. Those are culture. Those are, like, our denomination it's originally charismatic denomination. Mm-hmm. They fundamentally read the Bible differently. And one day we should talk about denominations. I can do a little of that here and what they're doing. It's not necessarily, and I used to think of it as like, oh, they decided, like, I disagree with you on this, so we're going to split and go this way. They're reading the Bible from different angles, which means they're doing different work. And if two people are doing different work, they belong in different departments of a company, right? But it's still the same company. So charismatics, Pentecostals, holiness movements really led by the Spirit, however they express themselves, are reading the Bible centered on the book of Acts. Their understanding of the church, their ecclesiology, ecclesia is the Greek word for church. Their ecclesiology is centered on the book of Acts. Everyone outside of that is typically considered Reformed. Baptists are considered Reformed. They call it Old Perspective sometimes. It's Reformed, it's Lutheran, it's Calvinist, but they all fit in like sort of one group, sort of called Reformed view of the Bible. They root their ecclesiology in the writings of Paul, which is why these churches are so different. Because Reformed churches are very much about church policy. They're very much about, like, there's rules for how we do church. Holiness movements are very much about discernment and following the Spirit of God, whatever God is doing. So in the holiness movements, they typically ordain women, because in the book of Acts, men and women are both prophesying and speaking, and the Holy Spirit comes upon everybody at once. That's how they interpret the church. In the Reformed movements, there are rules. You're gonna read, like Paul says, this is gonna happen, this is gonna happen, and they're not gonna do this, and they're not gonna do this. And so when you center your ecclesiology on Paul, you end up with that. If you center it on Acts, you end up with this whole other thing. And when these two groups come together, the mission is different and they can't get it together. And at some point, it's healthy just to say, it all belongs, but just so you know, if you become unenamored with this, we are here. Come worship with us. You know what I mean? But don't disavow your brothers and sisters. I have friends that have converted grew up Southern Baptist, and in their late 20s, they converted to Catholicism, which when I was a kid, that was considered satanic. But now they realize, no, I need liturgy, I need tradition. I need people guiding me through a daily, yearly ritual. And other people just need a stack of books and a group of 5 people, and they're going to learn intellectually.
Yeah. I was reading Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis, and he talked about Christianity as the hallway, and there are many rooms in the hallway, different denominations. Yeah. And it's a good place to choose a room, but you shouldn't stay in the hallway. And I've never really felt like which room is right for me to enter. I don't know.
Yeah, and there's a reason. There's lots of reasons why. I mean, in my church history for lunch, I'm actually going into like some of the first divisions of the church and why they separated. And it has to do with culture. You have the East and the West, Eastern Church and the Western Church. They're all Christians, but half of them are philosophers and the other half are lawyers. And that doesn't work. And we have their writings and we can look at them and we can say, oh, like when you pick up, where are we at? Where's my books? Here we are. So, Alexandria, Conclusion, Origin, and Tertullian. You pick up Origin and then you read Tertullian. You're going to think one of them is not a Christian, and you're not going to be sure who it is. Because neither of them are doing what you're doing. They're everywhere. But there were unifying factors, and there still is unifying factors. The Nicene Creed is a unifying factor in the church. Always has been. By and large, if you can say the Nicene Creed without crossing your fingers, you're in. You're one of us. You're my brother and sister. And notice what the Nicene Creed doesn't say. It doesn't say anything about ethics and morality. It doesn't say anything about heaven and hell. It doesn't say anything about interpreting Genesis or Revelation. It's simply a description of who God is revealed through Christ. And that's it. So denominationalism, I like to call it expressions. But Protestant Reformation, if I could get controversial, and I can, I'm not sure that it should have happened. I think there's better ways to do things. And I think had Luther had what we have now, it would have gone different but he just didn't have access to what we have now. Anyone else? I got 10 minutes.
I would say as a church today, how can we, with the current climate and social media, bring unity through the word of God to people without them considering that denomination or expression or that rivalry going on?
I think the only way
we separate from that.
I think the only way to bridge that is for us to understand the role that we actually play in the world, which is to be a people who this should be next week's thing. Honestly, I need to help you reinterpret the idea of what it means to be the image of God and what that means for the church. How that's our main role, is to be the image of God. Over and over again in the scriptures, it says, come out from among them and be ye separate. And that's not on display anywhere today. The early church, the best way, it's hard to say here's what you should do, but here's what the church did do in the first century. They were literally a surrogate government. They formed their own little governments in their house church, in their houses, where if instead of a lawsuit, they would gather as a people and say, here's our ruling. We listen to all the sides and you need to pay them, instead of taking it to the courts. That's why Paul says not to take it to the courts. They were a surrogate family. Jesus redefined the meaning of family to be, it's literally whoever you deem part of your family. And so it was no longer about blood. It was no longer about a household. I mean, it became actually about a household, but a different reason for being a household. Everything that they were doing was outside of the realm of what everyone else was doing. They were literally like this small group of people exercising this. It's as if like we started a new kingdom, called it Watermania, Watermark Mania, whatever. And we were like Watermarkville, and we started our own town, but we didn't bother going through all the legal methods of like getting a town charter and anything. Like it was all internal, and we governed ourselves. And anyone who came and was like, it was unification of thought, not culture or anything like that. And it was all us gathering, being led by the Spirit together, not some town charter. It went from the paper to our hearts. And that's actually another big difference between Reformed churches and holiness churches. Reformed churches put everything in writing and they have policies. They're big on church policy, and holiness movement churches are big on discernment. If in the book of Acts, God took the law and put it on our hearts, why are we trying to put it back on paper again and make everyone agree with us so that you can join? No. You welcome people in, and then the elders of the community would sit with them and discern. Maybe here's how you could dwell with your situation, with who you are, with how you're wired, with what you're doing. Here's how you can dwell in the community of God. Let's help you discern with the Spirit of God together. It's not taking the law and making it paper again. So I don't know if I'm even answering your question, Michaela. There is all kinds of ways that the church can navigate this, but the worst way to navigate this is for us to jump in the fight and take a side. That's terrible. So yeah, I don't know if that helped or not.
That helped a lot because it allows me to see a broader perspective of it rather than the minuscule side that we typically have where we're only looking from our end rather than.
Yeah. And so one of the main resources I've found, I guess it's Book Hour. That's what we're doing here. So Michael Gorman, one of my favorite modern theologians today. He's only like in his 50s, so he's got a lot more work to do too. So it's awesome. Michael Gorman wrote a book, The Death of the Messiah and the Birth of the New Covenant. This is a book on atonement, as it's a way of understanding the cross as a way to live. It uses the same word Scott McKnight uses a lot, cruciformity. This is a book that helps you understand, like, we as a people, we live by directly modeling Jesus. So there should be representation of the cross in our lives. We should be pouring ourselves out. There should be a visible sign that we're following a different king and that we're not really heavily invested in these earthly kingdoms other than the fact of bringing about justice in them. And there's all these different ways that the Christians aligned themselves and became a whole new people in the world. Like we're supposed to be a whole different people. They should look at us and say, we're weird. I mean, the Bible says, it calls us a city on a hill, salt and light, all that. That's our role. Sammy says, can you speak to the benefits of full inclusion of a marginalized group, Samaritans, in the face of oppressive dominant culture? Benefits of full inclusion of a marginalized. Oh man. Hearing, if you're an American and if you're like me, so I can talk about my experience. I'm a white male American and I have a specific experience, and it's easy for me to push my experience on everyone else and say, you have just as many opportunities I have and blah, blah, blah. And I don't feel any oppression. I don't experience anything difficult. My life honestly has been relatively easy. I think a lot of the reason that I was even able to become a pastor and a leader of a community is because I'm a white man with a beard. And I think my words just tend to have more weight in our society because of this. But when I listen to people from other perspectives, from the other side, different cultures, different races, different gender, like when I hear them, I hear a different story, and a story that I didn't know existed because I had no way of feeling it. When you bring that into the church, these are the people who are more able to tell us how to help than I am. I spoke at Michael Neely's church. New Millennium was a African-American church, our sister church. And leading up to it, I felt woefully inadequate because I don't know that I have anything to say to an African-American community. I feel like I need to learn. I think they have much more wisdom than I have because I have not experienced anything that they've experienced. And so I should not be pastoring a Black church. I'm not qualified. When I'm in the presence of people from another experience, I need to hear them. I need to listen to them. The worst thing I could do is step up and say, here's what you need to do. I can only tell people what they need to do if their experience is a lot like mine. That's kind of how it helps the community a lot. It helps us love people better. It helps us be more knowledgeable of what we're doing, of how to help. So that's my answer to that. I got 3 minutes, and then I got a phone call. Any last thoughts? There is a chance that I won't be able to do this every week. I've talked to the team. I actually have seminary classes starting up on Monday, and so I may need to do this every other week. I'm talking to them right now about what it looks like to do this on Tuesdays, every other Tuesday, and then on the opposite weeks, Bible history on Thursdays, like church history on Thursdays. So I'll let you guys know. These are all ideas. I just wanted to stick to the wall real quick to keep some semblance of community. But I'll be posting this video on, I'm recording it. I'll post this video on the Facebooks and all the stuff. And if you like ask a question or anything and you don't want to be seen on it, let me know and I can go in and edit it. Just hit me up. You said that Jesus is not interested in whose fault something is, but is interested in who's going to make it right. How do you respond when people don't want to hear the message of moving forward with peace and unity instead of focusing on topics that divide? How do you respond when people want to hear the message of moving forward with peace? You can't move forward until you know each other, until you listen to each other. People oftentimes are forced to carry their hurt for a very, very long time. So we do need to hear people out. I don't think Jesus is interested in casting blame, but he's interested in intimacy, getting to know. I would argue that's the whole essence of the incarnation. That's why Jesus came into this world, to liken himself to us, to know, so that we would know also that we are known. I mean, of course, God already knew everything from the outside. He didn't need to enter in. Maybe that was for us so that we would know that we are known. I think that helps a lot. If people know that you actually understand where they're coming from, a lot of the burden of the only way that a lot of injustice can begin to heal is when people know that you've seen them. So letting people know, I see you, what you've been through is wrong, it's an injustice, and I want you to know I saw it. That is the first step towards healing anybody. So, no, okay, hold on. I meant to say, how do you respond when people want to focus on unity, focus on black and white answers instead of unity? I think that's the same thing. I think I would offer the same answer. People need to know that you care enough to understand, to listen. They need to know that you're listening to their people, listening from their side. They need you to affirm the pain that they're feeling. And only then can they help, can you actually walk with them towards healing. So I think Jesus displayed that pretty well. So I need to wrap it up here. I'm so glad we had at one point 38 people in here. That's awesome. I hope you guys have an incredible week, and I'll let you know about the church history for lunch class. All right.
Thanks for teaching.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be well, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Tommy.
Thanks, Tommy.